we're talking about diaspora politics. We're defining the state. We're defining what politics is. Politics is basically, to cut a long story short, I went through different examples of what politics could be, but let's define politics as the ability to influence the state. There are three ways to influence the state. One is you take a militia and you march on the state capital. That was done in the 20th century. That's a form of basically violence, the warrior class. Then you can bribe the state. That's done. You can pay them to make speeches, functionaries in the state apparatus. You can pay them for policies. You can lobby the government. Okay, that's obviously a mercantile form of influence. Then you can have religious or priestly or ideological influence where, for instance, communists can infiltrate the government, or Jesuits or Freemasons or something. They can infiltrate the government. They're not necessarily using threats of violence. They're not using money. They're using ideology to infiltrate and influence the government. So those are basically the three ways that we can do politics, the ways that we can influence the state. There are certain functions of the state that are endemic to the state, and I use the metaphor of a dog. If you kick the dog is going to have an instinctual reaction. The dog is going to yelp. The dog is going to bark. The dog is going to bite you. The dog's going to fight or flight, basically. The dog might cower. But whatever that reaction of the dog is going to have a reaction. Whereas if you go up to a wolf in the wild and you show the wolf a treat or something, the wolf doesn't start doing tricks. The wolf hasn't been taught tricks. Once you domesticate wolves and make them dogs, which is both environmental and genetic, once you get that dog, then you can teach the dog tricks. In the same way, there are certain functions of the state that are endemic to the state. For instance, the state has to protect its monopoly on violence in order to remain a state. And so it has to defend against external enemies, internal enemies, criminals, terrorists, gangs, what have you. So those are functions of the state that no one needs to tell the state to do. You don't need a warrior class or lobbyists or ideologues to influence the state to perform those functions. The state sort of naturally performs those functions, just as the fact of we define states as monopolies on violence. Therefore, to maintain themselves, they have to act in those ways. But there are many other things that libertarians complain about that really are the crux of what we talk about when we're speaking of or influencing the state. So how do we influence the state? We influence the state, like I said, one of the three ways. I've argued in the past, and I'll continue to argue, that the warrior strategy of intimidating the state through violence, while it has worked in the past, I don't think will work today for a number of reasons. Basically, I have very low confidence in, well, let me even not talk about confidence. My assessment of the population is very low in terms of its ability to threaten the state via violence. That the state, its monopoly on violence is upheld by technological prowess. The majority of people do not have access to tanks or bombs, what have you. And also, even if it were the case that guerrilla warfare could work, I don't think that Western populations are psychologically or religiously or physically or spiritually equipped to engage in that kind of warfare. Obviously, the Taliban can. Obviously, the Viet Cong could. I don't believe that Western populations believe in anything firmly enough in order to carry that out. So that's why I argue, in order to have that kind of revolution in the first place, you would have to have some kind of spiritual revolution, which means that the work to be done in the here and now is not some kind of, militia organizing. That's not going to work. Of course, that's wrong. I disagree with that. The work that should be done is a spiritual revolution. Then once you've basically taken a population and you've found those who are actually willing to move forward with a way to make things better, and they're actually committed and they're quality people. Once you have that base, then you can expand it, grow it in any direction. You can make a bunch of money and you can lobby the government, or you can do your street marches. But until you actually have a spiritual base, you don't actually have anything. That's why I think basically the priestly function, the religious function is primary. So I'm going to talk about maybe 3 historical examples. And while I'm talking, I might come up with more, but I'm going to talk about 3 historical examples of diaspora powers throughout history, just so we have an understanding that that diaspora powers have been powerful in the past, and they are the way forward in many respects. And I think I just thought of a 4th while I was saying that. But let's talk about the first, which is the Indo-European diaspora. if you're going to argue that diasporas don't work, what do you make of the Indo-European diaspora? The Indo-European diaspora was not a centralized imperial state in the way, for instance, the Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the American Empire, British Empire, European colonial powers. The Indo-European expansion was not centralized. The Indo-European expansion was tribal. It was bifurcated, trifurcated, multifurcated. You had all these different splits going off in all these different directions. At that time, the technology didn't exist to have centralized communication. And what's more, that wouldn't have even really benefited them because they were fighting separate enemies for military, political, and linguistic cultural dominance over different areas of Eurasia. So they would go over into the West, and they would go into Europe, and they go into the South, into Iran, and they'd go into Turkey with the Hittites, and they go over to India, which of course, the Hindus. And they would go to all these different places, and they would not act as a state. They would act as a mobile diaspora, and they would go in, and they would win certain key battles, and they would institute themselves as a ruling class over the population. Now, you could say at that point they were instituting states, but the general strategy wasn't that we're going to stay in our little area, we're going to stay in our nation, we're going to respect borders, we're going to respect boundaries, we're going to respect other cultures and multiculturalism, and if we expand, that's going to decrease cultural diversity. They didn't have those concerns. They simply expanded. They didn't want to stay in their homelands. They were not concerned about living among people like themselves. Their mentality was they wanted to go out, they wanted to rule over people who were unlike themselves, and they wanted to take those people and influence those people. That's ultimately their behavior. When they went all the way to Ireland and all the way to Bangladesh, that was their behavior. That is how they acted. Again, ultimately, they did form, you could say, in a very early primitive sense, tribal states, tribal power structures. They did try to have their monopoly on violence. So in a sense, you could say they were forming states along the way, but their diaspora action preceded state action. So they wouldn't go over to India and say, we're going to lobby the Indian government, or maybe we're going to ask the Indian government, or I guess at this time it would be the Dravidian government. They didn't go over to the Dravidians and say, hey guys, maybe we should unite politically, or have you ever thought of like, I have an ideology for you, it's called nationalism, or they didn't use these methods. They sort of just went in and they started taking power. The tools that they had were violent means, but of course, violence is just one means of gaining power. We can use mercantile means, we can use spiritual means. They didn't go in and, well, they went in the first place, so they left their homeland. That's the first example. Second example I'd point out would be the Greeks. The Greeks, again, and alongside the Phoenicians, so I guess it's two examples, the Greeks go all around the Mediterranean. They don't stay in their homeland, they don't stay in Greece, they go to Spain, and they go to France, and they go to Italy, and they go to all these different places. They even go up into Russia, they go into the Crimea. The Phoenicians, who come from Phoenicia, they leave their homeland, and they go out, and they form all these little colonies. Again, when they form these colonies, this is about 800 to 600 BC, basically between the time of after the events of the Trojan War up until, the writings of Pythagoras and Thales and the early Greek philosophers. This is the colonial period of the Phoenicians and the Greeks in the Mediterranean. They don't have a centralized state. It's not as if there's one united Greek state that is going out and forming colonies as the European nation states did in the 16th century and forward. But they were decentralized from little Greek city-states. A band of people would just say, you know what, I think I'm going to go on a boat and we're going to go somewhere. Of course, there was planning involved as well, but they would go somewhere and then they would lose contact to an extent with where they came from, and they'd form a new city-state. It was not a centralized government. And they didn't go into places and just kill everybody. It wasn't like an Israelite model. They didn't go to France and just kill all the Gauls. They didn't go to Spain and kill all the Iberians. They didn't go to Crimea and kill all the Crimeans. They went there, they took power, they took charge, they formed little towns and cities, and then they integrated surrounding areas to expand their colonies. Phoenicians did the same thing. So again, this is a diaspora model. In the past, because at that time, actually currency was not international, so you couldn't just take a bunch of Greek coinage and go over to Iberia and say, I'd like to buy a plot of land. No, you just had to kind of go there and settle it. And you had to defend it. There wasn't international law. There wasn't international property law. It was sort of this wild anarchic tribalism. So you couldn't use a monetary method necessarily, although that could supplement your military force. And you weren't going to go there to convert people to Christianity necessarily, although the polytheists did, the Greek polytheists would worship their gods, and their spiritual strength did help them in the journey. So that's the Greek model as well as the Phoenician model. The Roman model, of course, is different, right? The Romans have a centralized state centered on Rome. They expand. They keep in contact, right? They have messengers go back and forth. There's a central government. There's a uniform rule of law. That's a different model. That's an imperial model. You could say the imperial model is the fusion of a diaspora model and a nation-state model. But we're going to leave that to the side for the moment because we're assuming that a pure diaspora model is not going to have a nation-state to help it. So then we can look at the Viking model, right? The Viking model, they start off in Scandinavia and they spread all over the place. The Finnish term for Swede is ruotsi. And ruotsi means rower, one who rows. And this is actually, this term, it kind of sounds like rower in a weird way, row. So this is actually adopted from a way that Swedes would describe themselves. We're the rowers, we're the rowing people. We row all the way over to Finland and we colonize it. So they were called the ruotsi. Now ruotsi might remind you of Russians, and they are not too distantly related perhaps, this concept of the Rus and ruotsi. So there might be a connection there. There are other etymologies of the word. But we know that Ruotsi colonized Finland. We know that Rus colonized the Volga River. They went up and down the Volga River. They served as mercenaries, Varangians, for the Byzantines. They went into Normandy, famously. They went into Normandy and then later conquered England. They actually colonized the south of Ireland. You'd think they would come from the north, but they actually did colonize from the south. They went into North Africa and actually fought battles with the Romans. You had, I believe it was Emperor Justinian, and he sent his general Belisarius to go to North Africa to reconquer, I suppose, the lands which would have been at some point in the past Phoenician lands, Carthage. So Belisarius goes to Carthage, he lands there, and he fights these Vikings who have taken over North Africa. Kind of bizarre to think about. There are a lot of maps we could put up that I used for the thumbnail that they actually went down into what is today northern Iran. So they really got around, these Vikings, let alone they went to Iceland, they went to Greenland, and they went to Vinland, which is part of North America. So the Vikings really got around. They weren't content to stay in their little happy homeland. They wanted to go out as a diaspora. Now, when they went out, there was no central Viking government. There was no collective Viking council that would tell all the Viking groups what to do. No, the Vikings left home, and they were pretty much free men who could do whatever they wanted. So there was no centralized authority. It was, you could say, rhizomatic. So that is the Viking model, and that eventually grows into the European aristocracy with the Frankish tribe, and the king of the Franks is, of course, Charlemagne. And Charlemagne starts a new imperial system in Europe, and now we're getting into nation states, but he and his descendants become all the kings and the queens and the dukes and the princes of all these different European states. And they go off and they marry all kinds of nobles and royals from these other states. And so essentially, if you look at any genealogy of a royal anywhere in the vicinity of Europe, whether it's Russia or Bulgaria or the Byzantines or the Italians or the Spanish, whoever, they're going to probably be able to trace their lineage back to Charlemagne. This was, for a while in the Holy Roman Empire, actually had a voting model. You're supposed to elect the emperor, and the emperor would be elected in accordance with whoever had the closest lineage to Charlemagne. So, of course, the Muslims had their own civil wars over who is most closely related to Muhammad. But the Holy Roman Empire, instead of having wars about it, they may have occasionally had conflicts, but the way it was supposed to work is you elect the person who you believe is closest related, direct descendant from Charlemagne. So this, again, you could see as a kind of Frankish diaspora model, in a sense that the Franks are expanding out over all these different nation states and they're ruling over these kingdoms. You can also look at the Normans as an extension of the Vikings ruling over these different places, and always maintaining a sense of separateness, not necessarily a Norman identity that's very particular, but we could say that they always do maintain a sense of their upper class heritage, their aristocratic heritage, which becomes English, but it's a different kind of English from the Anglo-Saxon peasant who doesn't know Latin, who doesn't know French, who doesn't have this lineage, who doesn't have this history. So that's maintained to this day, this strict sort of separation between the English ruling class and the English peasant class. So those are a couple of different models of diaspora politics, how diasporas can work without a centralized authority, without an imperial model. You can have a group of people go out into the world and they can be very successful, very impactful, and really create much of the world that we know today. I don't think the world as we know it would be possible without these diaspora models, which, again, as we go further and back in the past, the warrior class has more power, and so these tend to be more military models. But I think as we go forward into the future, we can see the way in which diasporas can be monetary in nature, they can be religious in nature. And we could throw out the Mormons, the Amish, the Judaism, different sects of Judaism. We could talk about Freemasonry. We could talk about the Jesuits. So there's a lot of different groups who are minorities, who are diasporas, who do have a real impact in the world, and we shouldn't dismiss them as a waste of time or as a failure. It also doesn't mean that we've seen the end of imperialism in the world, and it also doesn't mean that we're going to have a global united government tomorrow, even though there's a lot of participation between the United States and China. There are certain conflicts between the United States and China. Those two governments don't entirely get along. So rather than having an absolute position of, the future belongs to nationalism for all peoples, we're all going to respect each other's borders, I think we can throw that out as naive and completely invalidated by history. As a model, maybe you think that's what should be, but as an objective description of what you think will happen in the future, you'll probably toss that out. Probably also toss out the idea that the United Nations is going to be a functional government and that there's going to be no difference between states like China and America going forward. I think America will continue to Americanize Europe. I think that's a pretty consistent trend. If you look at any kind of cultural marker at all, by any standard, Europe's becoming more American. And even China is watching these Hollywood movies. So there is an American influence there, but I think we are going to continue to see a distinction between big power players, between these big global cultures. So there's going to continue to be a distinction to the extent that we can say, I don't think a one world global government, one world global religion is right around the corner. Is it possible at some point? Maybe. I think the principle of speciation means that the only way to get a planetary government in the truest sense would be to have multiple planets in the mix. So a Martian government, an Earth government, who knows what other kind of planets we could colonize. I think that would be necessary on the level almost of a biopsychology that I don't think people are capable of forming a united group unless they have an outgroup to point to. So you can't have a united global government if you can't point to an external force like the aliens or the Martians or somebody else that you define yourself in opposition to. The state always defines itself in opposition to another state. So I think we can also say that the extreme version of globalism or total globalism, undifferentiated globalism, is also probably not an accurate model of the next 10 to 20 years of the near future. But what's probably the most accurate of all the models is to look at a combination of imperial models, cultural spheres, Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations, Arthur Toynbee, models of the West versus China, also looking at Russia as its own kind of independent entity, which sometimes is against China, sometimes against the West, sometimes for itself, and cooperates at various times in various ways with the different power blocks. We can look at other power blocks that maybe could possibly in the future. Brazil right now is pretty much under the thumb of America, but maybe it could gain some kind of independence in the future. You can look at population projections of countries like Turkey, Egypt, Mexico. You can look at these projections and say maybe these states will be great powers, and they'll interrupt the bipolar world that we have, in which basically it's America and then this kind of Russia-China axis, a new Cold War. Maybe that can be broken down further and differentiated. It's a question of time scale. There's a lot of factors, but the big zoomed out picture, diasporas are going to have an impact on the future. Let's see, I did waste 16 minutes in silence, but we've gotten about 30 minutes into the thing. I'm going to take a look at some of these criticisms here, and you can read them along with me. So the arguments against diaspora politics, now that I've stated what it is, why I think it's effective, why I think it's historical, why it's going to continue to have an impact, and why it should be investigated as an effective strategy. Here are some criticisms. Power will not be acquired by retreating from the world. You're not going to obtain power from the middle of nowhere. So these arguments are sort of assuming that a diaspora model involves the construction of little cities and communities like the Amish. It's basically taking the Amish model and expanding that and generalizing it and saying that all diaspora politics can be reduced to the Orthodox Jewish shtetl. Shtetl is basically a term for a Jewish ghetto in Eastern Europe, or it can be reduced to the Mennonite colony. Basically, it's a little group, it's a little settlement that isolates itself from the surrounding world, keeps its culture, keeps its identity, and rejects the outside world. And I think that conflation is incorrect for all the models I've just shown. Indo-Europeans, the Vikings, the Normans, the Franks, all these people, I don't think they were retreating from the world. They were expanding into the world. So there is a passive form of a diaspora, which is insular, but then there's an active form of a diaspora, which seeks to get out into the world, to be an expatriate, to leave your homeland, to go somewhere else, and to look at the opportunities for power. Power will only be taken by engagement and appeals to the mainstream. Again, if we look historically, I don't think that the Indo-Europeans just went to these tribes and said, hey guys, you should really allow us to rule you because we're really nice and we have donuts. And I don't think this was the argument. I don't think it was even, if you accept us as rulers, it'll be in your interest. I don't think that was even the argument. I think that basically through warfare, through religious indoctrination perhaps, through rituals, and maybe through some kind of, display of wealth, display of jewelry, display of artwork. These were the tactics that were used, appealing to the mainstream, saying, okay, Dravidians, currently your taxes are too high. We're going to offer you lower taxes. Or, you know what, there's not enough government programs for you. Whether we're talking about the Indo-Europeans or the Vikings or the Normans, I don't think any of these people appealed directly to, quote unquote, the mainstream in order to take power. I don't think, and we'll get into more examples here of specific communities where I don't think this is the case. Orania is a failure. Again, looking at Orania as a diaspora model. South Afrikaners, rather than staying in Orania, they could spread out around the world and they could try to become politicians, business people, and so on internationally, still keep a conception of themselves as Afrikaners, but try to influence other governments in a way that they would gain power. Toward what end? Well, toward their survival generally. And then as they secure their survival, they can branch out from there. In the same way, maybe you could look at Mitt Romney. He's a Mormon. And he becomes governor of Massachusetts. He runs for the president of the United States. He doesn't entirely succeed, but it's that kind of attempt. Here's some more communes are failures, attack fringe people, attract misfits, there won't be women, there'll be few resources, ruralites don't want foreigners coming in. And those are some legitimate arguments, The problem is, I think that's a straw man of the diaspora model. And again, if we're not going to use the warrior class, what are we going to use? We're going to be talking about international business. We're going to be talking about international religion primarily. Remote villages are not useful. Refer to earlier argument. The only way they can survive is if they are non-ideological and pose no threat to the existing order. That's not in the cards. Well, that's an interesting point in itself, the idea that it's impossible to be non-ideological. I think actually it is, and it's actually necessary in a sense to be non-ideological. It doesn't mean you have to throw ideology out the window entirely, but it means that you have to have the ability to put ideology aside and focus on what matters. And also that you need to be able to, in a Sun Tzu manner, you need to be able to disguise your threat level. You need to be able to say, okay, yes, we have grand plans and we'd like to, in a sense, perhaps become more powerful, but we're not going to put that on show. We're not going to put that on display. We're not going to make a show of our power because we're more interested in power that is actual than power that is fantastic. You know, it's the difference between, say, when the bear stands up on his hind legs to make himself look powerful versus, you know, the predator, the hunter who is silent, who is invisible, but has real power. You will not attract elites. Who will be forced to ditch their careers and families to live in a hovel. Again, the idea that it's all about living in a physical community, you can have that. And I would say, even if you look at California, there are these diaspora communities. What is California? California at this point is majority Hispanic, Asian, Black. This is the demographics of California. There are communities in California that are not minority majority, and they're not forced to ditch their careers or families. They don't live in hovels. They actually live in the richest communities in California. You can look them up. There are these towns, these little villages in California. California is very rocky. It's very mountainous. So they live up on these hills and the Hollywood Hills, right? So that's a mercantile strategy. You basically get the rich people together and you can have your own community. Again, if we're not using a tripartite class structure analysis, then it devolves to a kind of, a sort of defanged warrior perspective where we're all going to live in trailer parks and things like that. Of course, that's not a good model ultimately. There's a certain extent to which if the Amish live in a poverty and they have a lot of kids, that can be good. If the Orthodox Jews live in poverty and Curious Joel and they have a lot of kids, that can be an advantage. But that can't be the only aspect of the diaspora strategy. Clearly, there's limitations to that as an exclusive model. You will not interact with the mainstream. You'll never see your community outside of scary media reports. I mean, that sounds like the majoritarian nationalist strategy already. The average person doesn't want to give up everything they know to live with strangers who share memes on the internet. And again, that's true. That's why you have to develop a group of people who are not average, who are above average. Ghettoization is not the path to success. I agree with that to an extent, that ghettoization alone cannot bring success. There are examples of Jewish ghettos. You could say the Amish, in a sense, are ghettoized. There are examples where that can be useful in a shell model. Not maybe majority of the population is in some kind of insular community, but then you have a minority of the population which is out into the world. You could look at Scandinavia in that way. Scandinavia, you have a population of Scandinavians, and a small number of them are Vikings who go out and they conquer surrounding territories. Overlooks low trust, toxic relations among people who are interested in change. People will bicker and fight more when they live with each other. Ideology is likely to cause friction. You would need more than ideology to build resilient networks. I agree with all that. I agree that, take out this word and just put internet people. Internet people who talk on the internet. That's obviously a problem. And the problem with internet people is they're too ideological. It's about taxes, or it's about genetics, or it's about some kind of intellectual minutia. And that is not enough. You need more than ideology. So I actually agree this is a good criticism that a good diaspora model, I don't think is solely based on ideology. I think it's based on something more transcendent than mere ideology. Then it gets into clandestine fraternal organizations, which is more along the lines of what I think an effective diaspora model would look like. People can go about their normal lives and belong to groups that seek a better tomorrow. Global networks like the Freemasons, where you maintain presence in every city. This would require huge cultural change, and I agree, but that is necessary in order to happen. Every plan for change requires huge cultural change. That's a tautology. That's a necessity. Diaspora cannot be maintained without having a home country. This obviously isn't true. If you look at the Jewish people, if you look at the Amish, if you look at the Mormons, if you look at the Freemasons, if you look at the... Do I need to go on? A diaspora can be maintained without having a home country. Communists, so we're going to go into communists and Zionists. Communists had intellectuals and the working class. Okay, awesome. No reason that a diaspora model, any sort of diaspora, couldn't appeal to intellectuals or the working class. Soviet Union sponsored communism. That's true, but communism, the Communist Manifesto, was written in 1848. And ultimately, that led up to the formation of the Soviet Union. But the diaspora preceded the state, not the other way around. Now we talk about the Zionists. The Zionists had powerful backers. Awesome, great. We should study Zionists and ask, how are they so successful? In terms of diaspora studies, minoritarian studies, we ask ourselves, how does a diaspora get powerful backers? What is that process? How do you infiltrate the elite? How do you make a lot of money? How is that done? Because it was done, and I don't think that, when I look at these groups, I don't see them as exceptional to the historical narrative. I see them as fulfilling certain strategies and niches, like the rhinoceros and the triceratops, one's from a lizard, one's from a mammal, but they both sort of occupy the same niche. So I'm not saying, convert to Judaism and move to Israel. I'm saying that the diaspora strategy is something that anyone can pursue from any perspective. At this time, I'm not prescribing what your religious group should be. I'm simply saying that it's theoretically possible that anyone, if they want to investigate the strategy and pursue the strategy, they can do that. Jews had an ethno-religious group. Okay, well, that is something that exists in other capacities. Like I've said, the Mormons are an ethno-religious group, the Amish are an ethno-religious group. So you can join one of those groups or you can found one of those groups. But I think that is the way to go forward. I think if you're rejecting this on the grounds that religion is icky and bad and divisive, well, you can say that and then you basically have nothing at the end of the day. I think you need to embrace some kind of religious model if you want to be successful. Now, that's differentiated from the status of people who are not religious for whatever reason, because I think in the same way that the ancient Mediterranean around the time of Christ was in a crisis of faith, people looked at the concept of religion with a big question mark in their minds, and it took many centuries for that question mark to be resolved. Even up into the time of Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't quite decided. So this is a historical process. We don't necessarily choose religion or invent religion, but the formation of new religion is a civilizational process. It's an evolutionary process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But in terms of understanding models of the future, who is going to inherit the earth? It's going to be religious groups of one stripe or another. If you reject religion on the grounds that it's too divisive and it splits people off, really what you're saying is religion divides the wheat from the chaff. Maybe you don't like that because you're the chaff and not the wheat. I don't know. I don't know what your internal frustration with religion is. But I think for the majority of people, it's not actually in opposition to religion in the most general sense, but it's a feeling of, I can't believe in it. I don't have faith in it. It doesn't seem authentic. There's too many choices. There's too many options. And of course, that's part of the capitalist consumer crisis of our time, that there are too many cults. There are too many options. There's just too many authorities. We can't decide which authority to accept. That's a general civilizational problem that the ancient people had as well. They had a problem whereas, should I be a Mithraist? Should I be a Christian? Should I be a pagan? Which cult should I follow? Should I follow these Egyptian pagan cults? Should I follow the Greeks? Should I follow the Roman? Should I be a Pythagorean? Should I be a monist? Should I be in this mystery cult? There's then various break-off schools. Should I be an Aristotelian? Should I be some kind of atheist? So should I be a Stoic? There were many different groups, right? There was a huge fracturing, and individuals couldn't figure it out. Basically, you had these, again, the Christian movement wasn't started it wasn't started by a state. It wasn't like the Emperor Nero said, I've invented Christianity and everyone's going to be forced to convert to it. But that was a process, that was almost a meritocratic process where Christianity had to win out over other competing religions. And it took time. It wasn't something you could snap your fingers and solve the problem. So this is something that might not be solved in our lifetimes. And there is really no eternal, quote-unquote, solution, because as things coalesce, they will then disintegrate in a cyclical process. But religion is going to be part of the future. It may disguise itself in some cases as atheism or science, but of course I've argued that those are really just religions which are so fanatical that they distinguish themselves from other religions as being not religions. In the same way that early monotheism said, oh, we're not like you polytheists, we only believe in one God. Atheists take it a step forward and they say, oh, we're not like you religious people, we don't believe in any gods. So we can talk more about that another time, but let's finish this up. Zionists and communists gain members through political activity. And a diaspora model doesn't require that you abstain from all political activity. Again, this black and white vision that you have to put 100% of your eggs in one basket or 100% in another, what I'm saying is people are not fully exploring the diaspora model. They're solely focused on, we have to get a majority of the voting population. Oh, Trump wasn't good enough, so we're going to have to get Tucker Carlson in there. How are we going to do this? How are we going to win the Electoral College? And I have to volunteer for my local political campaign, and I have to donate to a political campaign, and I have to do this activism. I have to convince my friends and family to vote for this political party. And when people solely focus on that 100%, I think that it's time to explore the diaspora model. Not everyone is going to be good at politics. Politics is really for people who are good speakers, good presenters, social people, people who can memorize a script, people who can talk off the cuff, people who can, make connections, people who can network. Not everyone's going to be very good at that, so not everyone should really be in politics. Some people are great for politics, and those people who are basically born for politics, let them be politicians. But other people who are not qualified to be a politician, maybe it's time to investigate the diaspora model, asking what it would be, and stop scapegoating it as I guess you're just going to live in a commune then. That's not really a fair shake of it. Communists were at the forefronts of the civil rights movement, were heavily enmeshed in union organizing. Zionists supported various political candidates. Interesting, we can't actually get a specific candidate here. They were not movements that gave up on the unwashed masses in politics. Well, this phrase right here, they didn't give up on the unwashed masses. That's an interesting turn of phrase. It sort of implies the opposite, that they invested in the unwashed masses. How much did Zionists invest in changing mainstream political opinion? How much did Zionists invest in trying to win over the German majority, the majority of the English public, the majority of the French public? No, Zionists concentrated on their own ethno-religious group. Zionists concentrated on people like Lord Balfour. Zionists concentrated on people like Winston Churchill. They concentrated not on the unwashed masses. So again, this double negative to not give up, the implication is that they did invest. But I don't think that's an accurate picture of what historically happened. Certainly, communism, the idea of communism was to convert the masses, but there was a significant intellectual portion where they were trying to convert intellectual classes before the masses. That's what Marx did. He didn't make public speeches to everybody. He argued with other intellectuals. So a lot of the mass movement, a part of communism, actually was preceded by this elitist and intellectual model and a more Bolshevik model of communism. Quote here, without the political struggle, we would be without a purpose. Well, if that's the case, maybe you need to reassess your concept of purpose. We stay relevant through political involvement and activity. Again, assess your concept of what is relevance. And also, is being relevant really the most important thing? Maybe, again, Zionists were not on the forefront of the average German or Englishman or Frenchman's mind in the 19th or 20th century. Doesn't mean Zionists weren't moving and shaking the scene and making things happen, but it just means that being relevant is not the end-all and be-all of power. We can't be religious. Again, that's just a mindset. That's something you've axiomatically asserted without any evidence. That it is fruitless to engage with religion, because clearly we are going through a kind of crisis of religion. It's not going to be solved by people being apathetic about it. We might not solve it in our lifetimes, but I think it is worth investment, because ultimately I think it's going to have to, that is the only solution. The best way to succeed is to engage with the mainstream. Again, look at the Zionist example, even look at the Marxist example. They didn't just go out on the street and start preaching, but they engaged not with the mainstream, but with esoteric intellectuals. If you look at the revolution of 1848, a lot of those people were not involved with street preaching. They were involved with esoteric Freemasonic societies. Richard Wagner, Wilhelm Marr, Giuseppe Mazzini. These people were Freemasons. They had their own little cafes and cliques and salons where they would discuss these esoteric ideas. You have people like Bruno Bauer who were writing these books that the majority of people weren't reading. He wasn't putting that forward. You know, the average person, the average literate person at least, might read the Bible. They weren't reading Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer had a very small audience. So sometimes engaging with the mainstream, historically speaking, is not something you start off doing first. That's something that comes later after you have an elite intellectual foundation. If politics were hopeless, the answer would be to turn to religion. Okay. Question mark, question mark. All right. So maybe there's your answer. Political struggle is not a dead end. It's our best path to salvation. I find this so rich that it's like a parody of an argument against itself. Calling political struggle salvation is a religious term. So already you're pointing to the idea that you're making a religion out of politics. And again, for the communists, that worked out quite well. But in some senses, communism, is that what you want to do? Or do you want to make a religion out of politics? Okay, but then at least acknowledge what you're doing, that ultimately that is still a religious solution to call politics your salvation. So we'll take a look at maybe if there was some interesting things going on. Deleting his videos made him unshadow banned. I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll see. I don't think so. I did it. It was the ripe opportunity. A lot of things came together, and I saw, I was thinking about like how my content is, of low quality, how I want to improve it. And then the book club deleted all his videos, and I was like, all right, it's time to refresh the page. K is an enjoyable mind. Thank you, Ismoff Ishness. Appreciate that. This ain't never would have happened if you let the intro rock. That's probably true. Love him or hate him, this dude be muted. Trope a lot. Big Daddy Canard in the house. Is that a rap song? Good evening. This is a list. It is not important where the list comes from. It's just a random list. If people want to say I'm straw manning, the criticisms, these aren't real criticisms. You've just selected a bunch of arguments that you can easily defeat. That's not the real arguments. Well, then make the arguments, and I'll argue against those arguments. But these are some of the very few arguments. No one's addressing the diaspora model, and when they do, they straw man it and they dismiss it. and I'm here to defend it. So I hope you liked it. I hope you appreciated it. I hope it tickled your brain and made you think. That's it for today. That's it for now. I will go over for DLive for a quick chess, Minecraft. Maybe I will even get into some of my drafts of some things I'm working on. If you want a preview of some future shows, head on over there. But until then, bye-bye.